Part 3. My Adventures as an Illustrator, Norman Rockwell. As we passed through the outskirts of the city, the brightly lighted trolley, with its load of passengers all in their Sunday best, darkness broken only by the lamp in a window and an occasional house. Soon, however, as the houses began to crowd up on one another, each corner was lit by a street lamp. Then, as the street became thronged with carriages and wagons, the lamps multiplied, and we were home again, weary, seat-sore, for the benches in a trolley were made of wood, and hard in spite of our thin pillows, and somewhat dazed by our glorious afternoon or evening on the trolley. Two memories of the city overshadow all else, unfairly perhaps. One is of the night President McKinley was shot. I remember the streets were dark except for the yellow pools of light beneath the gas lamps. The newsboys were shouting, "Extra, extra, extra! McKinley assassinated! Extra, extra!" And people were gathering under the gas lamps, reading the news, and brushing off their faces the moths and flies which swarmed about the light. There was a kind of horror in the streets, because I did not understand the meaning of the word assassinate. I thought McKinley had been killed in some cruel, torturing way. I was only 7 at the time. The next day we went to church, where they played "Near My God to Thee," McKinley's favorite song, and my father and mother cried. The other memory is of a vacant lot in the cold yellow light of late afternoon, the wind rustling in the dry grass, and a scrap of newspaper rolling slowly across the patches of dirty snow, and a drunken woman in filthy gray rags following a man and beating him over the head with an umbrella, the man stumbling through the coarse littered grass, his arms raised to cover his head, and the woman cursing and screaming, beating him incessantly until he fell, then standing over him, kicking and striking him again and again about the head and belly and legs. And I remember that we kids watched, silent, from the edges of the lot until a policeman ran up and grabbed the woman. Then the man got slowly up, seeing the policeman struggling with the woman, attacked him, swaying drunkenly and swearing. I forget how it ended, but the memory of that night and of that drunken woman became my image of the city. Against this image of the city, exaggerated and distorted as it is, I have never been able to rid myself of it entirely. I set the country. My family spent every summer until I was 9 or 10 years old in the country, at various farms which took in boarders. These country boarding houses weren't like the resorts of today. The advertisement in the New York papers would state tennis court, but when you arrived there wouldn't even be an old tennis ball kicking around on the floor, and you'd ask, "Say, where's the tennis court?" And the farmer would reply, "Oh, if you look under the hall stairs, you'll find the net. You string it anywhere in the meadow you want." Those boarding houses were just farms. The grown-ups played croquet or sat in the high, slat-backed rockers which lined the long front porch. We kids were left to do just about anything we wanted. We helped with the milking, fished, swam in the river or the muddy farm pond, trapped birds or cats, turtles, snakes, and one glorious morning a muskrat, smoked corn silk behind the barn, fell off wagons, horses, out of lofts, did everything, in fact, that country boys do except complain about the drudgery and boredom of the farm. It's queer. If I have no bad memories of my summers in the country, I also have very specific memories of incidents of, say, just what I did during the summer. I was 8 years old, or my stay at the boarding house in Florida, New York. Of my winters in the city, I have both a general impression, the sordidness, the filth, the drunks, and many memories of specific events and particular people. Ewald, the choir, Dirty Dewey. But those summers, as I look back on them now, more than 50 years later, have become a collection of random impressions, sights, sounds, smells, outside of time, not connected with a specific place or event, and altogether forming an image of sheer blissfulness, one long radiant summer. God knows a country cur has just as many fleas as any city mongrel, but I didn't see them, or if I did, they were crowded out by the first sleepy cries of the whippoorwill at dawn. Poor Will, whip poor Will. And long lazy afternoons spent fishing for bullheads, the emerald dragonflies darting around our heads. We called them darning needles, and endowed them with a deadly sting. Oh, it sounds corny enough when I tell it, rather like those port bowlers my grandfather used to paint. But that's the way I thought of the country then, and still do in spite of myself. Later on, I came to realize, reluctantly, that ugly things happen in the country as well as the city. Still, that didn't change my ideas. I like the country better. One time, I signed a year's lease on a studio in New York. 2 months later, as I was walking down 6th Avenue under the L, a man and a woman ran out of a tenement yelling at each other. Suddenly, the man knocked the woman down. The same day, I was having my lunch at Child's restaurant when an old man who was leaning against the window, about 6 feet from me, collapsed and died. These things happen in the country, but you don't see them. In the city, you are constantly confronted by unpleasantness. I find it sordid and unsettling. These blissful summers in the country, I remember the farm horses, their long shaggy manes hanging almost to the water as they drank, snuffling and blowing. After a day in the hayfields, the horse would raise its head for a moment, snorting and shifting his great hoofs, then drop it again to the water, so suddenly that I'd slide right down his neck, kerplunk, into the stream. The horse stopping his drinking to look calmly at this sudden apparition splashing in the shallows, and the hot heavy smell of the horses as we currycombed them in the barn afterward, stretching up on tiptoe to reach the broad expanse of their backs, watching with satisfaction as the marks left by the harness disappeared. I remember wrestling and tumbling in the mow until we collapsed, exhausted, in the warm fragment hay and lay dazed, with the rough hewn beams of the roof dark and immense above us, and dust motes swirling in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight. I remember throwing off my shoes and socks to wiggle my bare toes in the cool green grass on our first day in the country, then running off gingerly over the gravel road and hay stubble in the field to the river for our first swim. The hay rides, all the boarders singing. I remember my father sang a pretty good tenor as the horses trotted along the dark country lanes. The excitement of eating lunch with the threshing crew at the long board tables, hunting bullfrogs with a scrap of red silk tied to the end of a pole. The turtles and frogs were carried back to the city in the fall, snuffling and crying in the train, because summer was over and we had to leave the country. I remember we'd put the frogs and turtles in a bowl of water and feed them religiously every day, but invariably, 2 months later, we'd find them floating dead in the bowl, and then that summer was dead too. Sentimental trash? Maybe. But that's how I saw the country. I actually lived the idealized version of the life of a farm boy in the late 19th century. I remember that. Once in the country, even I changed. In the city, we kids delighted to go up on the roof of our apartment house and spit down on the passerby in the street below. But we never did things like that in the country. The clean air, the green fields, the 1,001 things to do, the raw-boned farmers, their faces burned a deep brick red by the sun and the wind, but with that circle of pure white skin just below the hairline where their hats shaded their foreheads, got somehow into us and changed our personalities as much as the sun changed the color of our skins. I would not have dwelt so long upon these summers I spent in the country as a child, except that I think they had a lot to do with what I painted later on. Every artist has his own peculiar way of looking at life. It determines his treatment of his subject matter. Coles Phillips, another illustrator, and I used to use the same girl as a model. She was attractive, almost beautiful, but in his paintings, Coles Phillips made her sexy, sophisticated, and wickedly beautiful. When I painted her, she became a nice, sensible girl, wholesome and rather drab. To put it another way, if you asked Picasso and me to paint a picture of, say, a woman sitting before a mirror, well, I guess you see what I mean. The two paintings would be totally different, yet both would be of the same woman before the same mirror. The view of life I communicate in my pictures excludes the sordid and ugly. I paint life as I would like it to be. Somebody once said that I paint the kind of girls your mother would want you to marry. In 1951, I painted a post cover for the Thanksgiving issue of an old woman and a boy saying grace in a shabby railroad restaurant. The people around them were staring, some surprised, some puzzled, some remembering their own lost childhood, but all respectful. If you actually saw such a scene in a railroad station, some of the people sitting staring at the old woman and the boy would have been respectful, some indifferent, probably a majority, some insulting and rude, and perhaps a few would have been angry, but I didn't see it that way. I just naturally made the people respectful. The picture is not absolutely true to life. It's not a photograph of an actual scene, but the scene as I saw it. Frederick Remington painted the romantic, glorious aspects of the West. Cowboys sitting around a campfire, an attack at a stagecoach. Any old-timer can tell you that the West was a lot more than that. That life in the Wild West was at times pretty drab. But Remington, who was born and raised in upstate New York and traveled in the West as a tourist, didn't experience that drudgery and boredom. Just as I miss the dullness of farm life, I doubt that I would have idealized the country if I had grown up as a farm boy. I sometimes think we paint to fulfill ourselves in our lives, to supply the things we want and don't have. I knew a real country yokel in an art school. 5 years later, I met him again. We wore spats, carried a cane. He wore spats, carried a cane, and kept his black derby on when he painted. He had become a famous fashion illustrator and cosmopolite. Maybe as I grew up and found that the world wasn't the perfectly pleasant place I had thought it to be, I unconsciously decided that even if it wasn't an ideal world, it should be, and so painted only the ideal aspects of it. Pictures in which there were no drunken slatherns or self-centered mothers, in which, on the contrary, there were only foxy grandpas who played baseball with their kids, and boys fished from logs and got up circuses in the backyard. If there was sadness in this created world of mine, it was a pleasant sadness. If there were problems, they were humorous problems. The people in my pictures aren't mentally ill or deformed. The situations they get into are commonplace, everyday situations, not the agonizing crises and tangles of life. The summers I spent in the country as a child became part of this idealized view of life. Those summers seemed blissful, sort of a happy dream, but I wasn't a country boy. I didn't really live that kind of life, except, heads up, here comes the point of the whole digression, later on in my paintings. Of course, country people do fit into my kind of picture better than city people. Their faces are more open, expressive, lacking the cold veneer behind which city people seem to hide. I guess I have a bad case of the American nostalgia for the clean, simple country life as opposed to the complicated world of a city. Other things contributed to making me paint what I do the way I do. For one thing, I have always wanted everybody to like my work. I could never be satisfied with just the approval of the critics, and boy, I've certainly had to be satisfied without it, or a small group of kindred souls, so I've painted pictures that didn't disturb anybody, that I knew everyone would understand and like. Everybody who comes into my studio, from the grocery boy to the vice president of an advertising agency, has to comment on the picture I'm painting, and I take all the comments to heart. Maybe, to be completely honest, the fact that this type of picture pays well has something to do with it too. I sometimes think all this is a weakness. I know I'm not satisfied with my work. At times it seems shallow, incomplete, but that keeps me working. If I thought I was perfect or even close to it, I'd probably pawn my brushes and quit. Okay. There we go. Chapter 3. I Meet the Body Beautiful. I think I've always wanted to be an artist. I certainly can't remember ever wanting to be anything else. Not that I awoke one morning with the full-blown idea swimming about in my head. It was gradual. I drew, then I found I liked to draw, and finally, after I had got to know something about myself and the people and things around me, I found that I didn't want to do anything else but draw. At first, though, my ability was just something I had, like a bag of lemon drops. Jarvis could jump over 3 orange crates. Jack Outwater had an uncle who had seen a pirate. George Dugan could wiggle his ears. I could draw. I never thought much about it. A bunch of us kids would be sitting around on the stoop, and somebody would say, "Let's go up to Amsterdam Avenue and look in the saloons." "No, we did that yesterday." Silence. "Say, Norm, draw something." So I'd draw a lion or a fire engine on the sidewalk with a piece of chalk. But it was just as likely that someone would ask George Dugan to wiggle his ears. I remember that when I was 6 or 7 years old, I used to draw ships on pieces of cardboard for my brother and another boy. I worked from the picture cards of ships, which were included in every package of American Fleet cigarettes in those days, and which all of us kids collected and traded back and forth. Cards and cigarettes celebrated Admiral Dewey's victory at Manila Bay. Jarvis and his friends would cut the ships out and make little stands for them. Then they'd arrange their fleets in battle order on the floor, and each would try to cut up the others with scissors. It was sort of a frustrating form of art for me. 5 minutes after I had drawn the fleet, laboriously copying, with much smudgy erasing, Jarvis and his friends would have cut them to shreds. My father used to copy drawings from magazines in his spare time. I sketched dogs, houses, vegetables, and from my imagination, pirates, whales, Indians. I drew pictures, as I said, of the characters in Dickens. I found I liked to draw. Every so often, at school, a teacher would hang one of my drawings on the blackboard, or I'd be sent to show a drawing to Mr. Holly, the principal. Once I remember, after I'd shown him a drawing, I went home and told my mother that he'd asked me to stand in assembly before the whole school, holding up my drawing, and describe how I'd done it. The next day, my mother came to school all excited and said to my teacher, "Isn't it wonderful, Mr. Holly had Norman Percival show his drawing in assembly?" The teacher glanced at me. I looked down at my desk, blushing, terribly ashamed. But it was my ability to draw impressed the grown-ups occasionally. It didn't knock down any horses in the estimation of other kids, and it counted even less as we grew older. George Dugan lost stature when the ability to wiggle his ears became less impressive to us kids than, say, how well he played baseball. I lost stature in the same way. I could draw. So what? Could I play baseball or throw a rock over Mr. Cheney's house or lick my brother? Those were the important things now, both to me and to the other kids. Our values had changed. The athlete was top dog. I was a skinny kid, not unhealthy, but not robustly healthy either. My mother used to call me Snow in the Face because I got so pale. The other kids called me Moony because I wore glasses. Round glasses were new then, the more usual type being long and narrow. Our occultist was progressive, so I had the round rimless kind. How I hated that name Mooney. When I was 10 years old, I began a program of exercises to strengthen myself. Every morning I would do push-ups, deep knee bends, jumping jacks, or etc. before the mirror in my room. But every morning when I picked myself up, panting, and looked in the mirror to see the improvement, I was confronted by the same long neck and that protruding Adam's apple, which was such an embarrassment to me. The same narrow shoulders, jelly arms, thin, measly-looking legs. After a month or so, I gave up the exercises. My parents bought me all sorts of orthopedic shoes to correct my pigeon toes, till I began to think I was some sort of cripple. I used to practice walking with my toes turned in. If I heard someone coming up behind me on my way to school, I'd wrench my feet into a V and walk on the sides of my shoes. After a while, I gave that up as a lost cause, too. But my brother Jarvis, who was a year and a half older than I had no other brothers or sisters, by the way, was the best athlete in the school. He was a real boy's boy, adventurous, fearless, always ready to take a dare, strong, athletic. I remember there was a candy store about 4 blocks from our house in Merrimack, where, again, by the way, we had moved when I was 9 or 10. And some kid or other was always yelling, "Come on, last one to the store's a rotten egg." Jarvis always came in first. I always came in last, puffing and blowing. There's always competition between brothers. I just couldn't compete with mine. Bob Titus, a big handsome athlete, who had been my closest friend, drifted away from me and began to hang around with Jarvis. So when I got to be 10 or 11 and began to be aware of myself and how I stood with the world, I didn't think too much of myself. I could see I wasn't God's gift to man in general, or to the baseball coach in particular. A lump, a long, skinny nothing, a beanpole without the beans. That's what I was. I used to pull my sleeve over my hand when we walked along the street so that people would think that I had only one hand and feel sorry for me, or I'd develop a crooked limp. At that age, boys who are athletes are expressing themselves fully. They have an identity, a recognized place among the other boys. I didn't have that. All I had was the ability to draw, which, as far as I could see, didn't count for much. But because it was all I had, I began to make it my whole life. I drew all the time. Gradually, my narrow shoulders, long neck, and pigeon toes became less important to me. My feelings no longer paralyzed me. I drew and drew and drew. During my first year in high school, I went every Saturday to study art at the Chase School in New York City. After Thanksgiving, the high school principal let me off every Wednesday so that I could attend the Chase School twice a week. Wednesdays and Saturdays. I would get the trolley at Palmer Avenue in Merrimack at 7 in the morning and ride to 188th Street and Bronx Park, where I took the subway, transferring to the west side at 125th Street. It was a 2-hour trip each way. Going by train would have been faster and simpler, but the longer way was cheaper. In the middle of my sophomore year in high school, when I was 16 years old, I quit and began to go to art school full time. I put everything into my work. A lot of artists do that. Their work is the only thing they've got that gives them an identity. I feel that I don't have anything else, that I must keep working or I'll go back to being pigeon-toed, narrow-shouldered, a lump. When I was younger, I used to work night and day, possessed by a sort of panic that I'd lose everything if I didn't drive myself. I've given up the night work lately, but the drive is still in me. People ask me why I don't take vacations or retire altogether. I can't stop work. That's the long and the short of it. I've told you what kind of a kid I was part of the time. Don't think, though I've given you that impression, that I was as gloomy as a squashed blueberry all the time. I did lots of things besides snivel about the size of my Adam's apple. I helped build a bobsled. We called it the Jolly 8. I went camping, and Snoozer Maurice, true to his name, went to sleep and fell head first into the pot of beans we were cooking for supper. He became an aviator in World War I and was killed in France. I was a member of the Fortnightly Club, a club of cultural uplift. The other members were older than I was, and only let me in to pair me off with a girl who had clammy hands. I can remember walking into a room in a friend's house during a swimming party one summer afternoon when I was 10 or 12 years old. The sunlight was streaming through the open windows. A warm breeze curled in the curtains. All around the room, lying in disorder, on chairs, tables, the windowsills, were girls' underthings, white bloomers, white bodices, with blue frills, lacy slips. I stopped, utterly thrilled by a sense of femininity. I could hear the shouts of the bathers on the beach below the open windows. The pink ribbons on a bodice stirred in the breeze. I felt I had penetrated into the strange secret world of girls which had heretofore been closed to me. I could hardly breathe. The sense of it was so strong. The delicate frilled underlings, white and soft in the sunlight, seemed suddenly, for the first time in my life, to show me what girls were. They weren't just annoying creatures who threw a baseball awkwardly with only their forearms and wrists. Girls were different, and I didn't understand how they were different, but I felt it, standing in that room with the gulls screeching outside and the shrill cries of the bathers drifting up to me. Jarvis, Bob Titus, Hurlbert McAndrew, and I watched a disinterment. Around the corner and down one block from our house in Merrimonic, there was a small back lot. The remnants of a picket fence, a toppled post or two, some rotting pails, were scattered around the edges of the lot. From the weeds and refuse protruded 5 or 6 old gravestones, crusted with moss and gray lichen. The top of one lay broken in the weeds. Another had been uprooted by the gnarled tree which many years before had sprouted up in the center of the lot. The others sagged, pulled to the ground by vines. One rainy night, about 9 o'clock, 2 black-covered carriages and an open wagon drove up to the old graveyard. A new pine coffin glimmered whitely in the wagon. Several men in business suits got out of the carriages, and 2 men in overalls unloaded some picks and shovels from the wagon. After the men in business suits had examined the gravestones by the light of a kerosene lantern, they set the lantern on the ground beside a grave, and the 2 men in overalls began to dig. As they worked, their shovels now and then screeched on a rock, the earth piling up to one side. A wind blew up from the sound and sighed through the scraggly branches of the old tree. A dog barked over on Prospect Street. The lantern hissed. One of the horses snorted and stamped. Jarvis, Bob, Hurlbert, and I edged closer together. Then there came a dull thud from the grave, and the 2 men tossed their shovels into the pile of dirt and climbed out. One of the men in business suits pulled a trowel from his pocket and lowered himself gingerly into the grave, while another spread out a white sheet on the weeds. After banging and stamping about for a minute, the man in the grave swore softly and, sucking his thumb, handed up some rotted boards, splintered and broken. Then he passed up a leg bone, and after that some arm bones, a pelvis, fingers, fragments of a backbone, while his companions assembled the skeleton on the sheet, pausing now and then to argue in hushed tones about the placement of one of the bones. A few tatters of cloth hung to the ribs. Angleworms and beetles dropped from the bones as they appeared over the edge of the grave. Finally, up came a dark, moldy brown skull, caked with mud, long wisps of hair ruffling in the wind. After each one of the men in business suits had taken the lantern into the grave and scuffled and scraped about, they loaded the sheet of bones into the coffin, snuffed out the lantern, and drove off. With the last clatter of the wagon rounding the corner from into Prospect Street, the spell dissolved, and we realized to our horror that the night was black and we were alone beside an open grave. Even the company of body snatchers was better than none at all. So we ran home, only to learn, to our great disappointment, that the affair was legitimate. A party of historians and professional gravediggers had been sent to disinter the remains of a colonial figure and remove them to a more decent graveyard. I sang in the choir of our church, not enjoying it very much, though in Merrimonic it was a less arduous duty than at St. Luke's in New York City. There, the choirmaster, an old German, had bullied and threatened and harshly scolded us until we sang, as everybody said, like little angels. At rehearsals, we had to sit on high stools around a grand piano, our heads just on a level with the broad, shiny top. When one of us hit a false note or dozed off, the choirmaster would slide a hymn book sharply across the smooth surface of the top of the piano so that it cracked the culprit on the head. It was uncanny. He never missed. We were mortally afraid of him. He'd rage about on his piano bench, calling us all sorts of names, reaching out to cuff the boys nearest him while he perched there, white-faced, on our stools. He was a tyrannical master, a real martinet, but I dare say he could not have got us to sing as beautifully as we did except by treating us harshly. We were only kids, most of us not more than 7 or 8 years old, and we would have skipped rehearsals or sung lackadaisically if we had not been so fearful of provoking his wrath. Jarvis and I had a reason for not wanting to attend rehearsals. A slum lay between our house and the church. We'd walk hurriedly through the dim, gas-lighted streets. Gangs of ragged children taunted us. Drunken men lurched against us. We clutched rocks in our fists, expecting every minute to be set upon. But in Mararoneck, a quiet commuter's town, the choir's boys were treated with more leniency, and we had good times and enjoyed ourselves more, and of course sang jarringly at times, never matching the excellence of the St. Luke's choir. One thing rankled. I was paid $1.50 every Sunday, but my mother always made me give it back. I didn't understand that. I thought that I had earned the money and was entitled to keep it. A hill jutted up beside the church in Mararoneck. On top of it was a wayward girls' home. After services on Sunday, 4 or 5 of us would climb up into the belfry of the church in our black cassocks and white surplices and yell across at the wayward girls, teasing them. One day the sexton locked us in the belfry by mistake. For 2 hours we shouted and waved our surplices at the passers-by in the street below. They glanced up and waved back. A dog came along and barked at us. Finally, someone understood and let us out so we could go home for dinner. "Norman Percival," said my mother, "you're late. Dinner is spoiled, and after I worked so hard." "I was locked in the belfry," I said. "And what were you doing in the belfry?" asked my father. "I felt faint," I said. "I wanted air. So I was dosed with castor oil." The front of the choir stall was of open work carved wood. When one of our friends came forward to be confirmed, shuffling slowly along with the other boys and girls 4 abreast, we'd reach through the carving and grab his knickers. He'd try to move, but he couldn't. Blush, jerk his leg forward, we'd jerk it back. "For Christ's sake," he'd mutter, "let me go, will ya?" And he'd lunge forward, knocking against the kid in front of him. Sometimes we'd get a hold of a girl's skirt. She'd reach around and pull at it, staring straight ahead. "Norman Percival Rockwell," she'd whisper fiercely, "you let go of my skirt this minute or I'll tell your mother on you." Tattle. On rainy Sundays when few people came to church, there would be sacramental wine left over, but it could not be thrown away. It had to be drunk. So the minister, the sexton, Bob Titus, and I would drink it, and I'd go home for dinner, soused. The choir master, a carpenter with a magnificent voice, often came to church soused. Then Bob Titus, the sexton, and I would have to wrestle him into his cassock and surplice and march him out to the choir stall. It was all we could do to support him, yet he always sang beautifully. That was the underside of church life. That and the sexton polishing the altar cross. He'd spit on it and rub it with the soiled cloth, all the while grumbling and swearing under his breath. I used to wonder about that. Somehow it didn't seem right, but after a while I learned to accept that sort of thing. I helped hang the high school principal's long underwear on the flagpole. I cheered at football games. I thought I heard my grandmother say the MHS won a game today with a rebo and a ribo and a rebo rum. Boom got a cat trap bigger than a rat trap. Sis boom ba. Mararoneck High School, rah rah rah. I was assigned a paper on Tennyson's Lady of the Lake, and having learned that the teacher, Miss Genevieve Allen, only read the first and last page of our essays, I put 10 blank sheets of paper between 2 sheets covered with writing. When Miss Allen said, "Norman has written the best essay in the class," I straightaway determined on a life of crime. It paid. But when she added, "And now he will read it to us," I suddenly discovered the fires of hell. And as I couldn't sink into my shoes, though Lord knows it's strained, I blurted out the truth. Honestly, I thought, if not the best policy, was at least the safest. And that concludes part 3 of the Norman Rockwell autobiography, My Adventures as an Illustrator. Stay tuned for the next Drawing with Alan, where I should pick up with part 4. Thank you.